The concept of a spectral revolution means several related things. The word spectre has a number of different meanings. One of the reasons why I chose it to develop the concept of the spectral revolution is because of its polyvalence or multiplicity of meaning. I wanted to capitalize on all of the different meanings that it has. First of all, spectre or spectral evokes the spectrum. In other words, a phenomenon wherein there are no sharp divisions or clear distinctions. The spectral is consequently the undoing or undermining of various binary oppositions. For example, the binary oppositions of light versus darkness, being versus nothingness, truth versus deceit, good versus evil, spirit versus matter, male versus female, and left versus right. One thing that I mean to suggest by spectral revolution is the revolution that undoes or deconstructs all of these binary oppositions. This revolution would reveal that we are projecting these binary structures onto the spectrum of phenomena for various utilitarian purposes, and that these sharp distinctions are not intrinsic to existence. A spectre is also what is yet to come. This is how Karl Marx uses the term spectre in the opening of his Communist Manifesto, when he writes, with Engels, that, quote, "There is a spectre haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." In this sense, the word spectre is also very closely related to revolution, because Marx was advocating a global communist revolution. In any case, the spectral is also what is yet to come. What I mean to suggest by that is that Heraclitus was right that we live in a cosmos that is a process. We do not live in an already completed whole, as Parmenides or as the Vedic sages believed, with their concept of Brahman, or one unified being that is eternally complete, in light of which our experience of time is Maya, or illusion. Rather, time is real, and nature is a process. The futural or future-oriented character of existence itself makes the world spectral. Once one starts to think of existence as becoming rather than as static being, one realizes that all of these binary oppositions are also only relative, and they are constantly deconstructed and reconstructed by the process of existence. The third meaning of spectre is the idea of a ghost, which is the most commonly understood meaning of the word. Here I am trying to suggest that the essence of technological science is something ghostly. Although we tend to think of science, and especially technology, as the most materially tangible thing in the world, and despite the fact that our current scientific establishment is working with a materialist paradigm, the whole of technoscientific development is actually a ghostly phenomenon. It is almost like demonic possession, wherein the archetype of Prometheus is working his will through us onto the world. The question is whether we want that to be a passive relationship, or whether we can transform it into an active rapport that is more constructive. In what follows, we will look at the spectral revolution in terms of its being the final scientific revolution, one which is not superseded because it renders science post-paradigmatic and puts science into a state of permanent revolution. This in turn requires us to consider the spectral with a view to technoscience, or the unity of technology and science, or rather, the technological essence, or spirit of science. Then, the spectral revolution will be considered in terms of the socio-political upheaval that it is bound to cause, a more revolutionary social upheaval than that of any political revolution thus far. Finally, we will end with an examination of the spectre of the spectral revolution, namely Prometheus, identifying the various aspects or facets of this archetype that are relevant to defining the ethos of a society on the other side of the spectral revolution. The idea of a scientific revolution that would move us beyond the Cartesian paradigm is one that has been thrown around for some time now. But something far more radical than that is at stake in any profound consideration of the evidence for extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. One of the reasons why this scientific revolution has yet to take place is because there are very deeply entrenched social and political interests that are threatened by it. In effect, we would have to imagine a new form of society in order to carry through this scientific revolution. As far back as the early 19th century, there were serious scientists in places like Cambridge and Boston researching what they at that time widely referred to as psychical phenomena. This included telepathy, clairvoyance, and what they called premonitions and telekinesis in those days, and which are now referred to as precognition and psychokinesis. As early as 1909, William James, who was one of the pioneers in this field, came out with the claim that evidence for such phenomena would affect the next scientific revolution, and that this would take place in, quote, the next generation, unquote. That did not happen. There was very sophisticated parapsychology research in the 1930s and 40s being carried out at a few prestigious institutions by people like J.B. Rhine. But this remained very far from bringing about a revolution in the scientific establishment as a whole. In fact, in the 2 generations following that, up to our own time, we have yet to see data from parapsychology research result in a scientific revolution. Why is this the case? Why is the spectral revolution not the same as the Copernican revolution or the Darwinian revolution? Why is it more than just another paradigm shift in the history of science? It has to do with the inextricability of frameworks of knowledge from systems of power. We are inclined to think that when one ascertains knowledge about something, it has an objective validity that is neutral with respect to socio-political agendas. Despite whatever obstacles one might face in terms of getting institutions to support one's research and so forth, eventually the truth will prevail, as if the truth were something value-neutral. However, there is no such thing as a value-neutral structure of knowledge. Every substantively new form of knowledge implies a reorganization of political power. Moreover, the reorganization that is at play here is more revolutionary than any other in the history of science. It would demand a total restructuring of our society. Mainstream modern scientists are not going to be able to delay this revolution indefinitely. When a serious attempt is made to replicate human intelligence in a computer and to achieve an artificial intelligence that is really conscious, it will become clear to the researchers involved that they are working with a flawed mechanistic model of the mind. When they do not get the results that they would expect, and instead begin encountering spooky phenomena in very well-funded AI research programs at places like MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon, confronting the psychical dimension of human experience will become unavoidable. AI researchers are going to have to take things like ESP seriously, simply because without doing that, certain problems in their research and development programs will remain insurmountable and intractable. In a paper that he wrote in the 1950s, Alan Turing admitted that the one major problem with his scenario of the Turing test was that telepathy may be a genuine human capability. He took this possibility very seriously. The spectral revolution is going to become inevitable as we approach what some call the technological singularity. In this sense, the revolution itself is a specter, or something that is on its way and destined to come. As robotics and AI research move toward an attempt to really replicate human capabilities in a machine, they will spectacularly fail. This is a place where biotechnology is going to become very important because once they recognize that things like ESP and psychokinesis are real, mainstream researchers will also realize that these are properties of organisms. If we want to develop an artificial intelligence that does not fail because of an overly mechanistic model of the mind, we are going to have to take a biomechanical approach to it. So we may see AI developed that also has extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, and so forth. Technology is often considered applied science, But technology is essential to science. Technology is the more fundamental phenomenon without which the most basic sciences could not be elaborated. Even for geometry, one needs basic writing instruments and ways to measure straight lines. It is not simply a question of the historical fact that technology preceded science chronologically. Our theoretical world pictures are not mirrors of an objective reality. They are models of the world. They have an ultimately practical significance. They allow us to get a better handle on nature. Science is essentially technological. It is technoscience. Parapsychologists who, despite the marginalization of these phenomena, continue to research them, often try to elaborate what amounts to a new metaphysics in order to explain their data. They want to replace the Cartesian paradigm of modern science with a new paradigm or framework of knowledge. They miss the deeper significance of these phenomena, which is that the spectral ought to give us an insight into what model building is. Studying spectral phenomena should help us to understand how we construct frameworks of knowledge, beginning with the recognition that scientific paradigms and the theories that they make possible are psychologically and socially constructed. We have no objective access to the putative reality that has been so long sought after by scientists, metaphysicians, and mystics. There are different forms of life in nature, and they have various finite horizons of experience, based on what their vital interests are. There is no objective perspective or standpoint. In order to better understand how science is a model-building enterprise, we have to reconceive what technology is. The Greek root of technology is the word techne, which means craft, in the sense of arts and crafts, and consequently it has a broader connotation of technique, not just machinery that is used in order to manipulate the world, but techniques that one cultivates so as to attain greater capacities of control. Technology is more fundamentally mechane, or machination, and only secondarily mechanical. Anything mechanical presupposes crafty machination. Psychical ability is a form of technology in the Greek sense of technology. Once we realize that our mechanistic models of the world are just that, and not mirrors to some objective reality, there is no reason why psychical abilities could not be developed as a form of technology. We have overdeveloped our technical intellect and atrophied various instinctual abilities that we share in common with animals. We can regain these abilities on the level not of mere instinct, but of a cultivated intuition. In the course of more than a century of research, parapsychology has produced a mountain of empirical data definitively demonstrating ESP and PK. The spectral revolution, unlike the Copernican revolution or the Darwinian revolution, has been resisted for so long only because spectral phenomena pose such fundamental challenges to the way that society is organized. Who wants to live in a world where your neighbor can become a well-trained telepath and read your intentions better than your spouse? Or where people can remotely view what you do in your most intimate moments inside your home? Or where the patents of corporations are not secure from remote viewing? Where the stock market could be predicted in advance by means of precognition? This calls into question the entire structure of capitalism and means that we would be forced to move to a different kind of economic system. Consider the fact that patents could not be protected by corporations. Remote viewing would allow corporations to steal patents from individuals working at other companies before these persons have even fully worked out their ideas or inventions, let alone filed for a patent on it. There is a tremendous potential for social destabilization and for the disintegration of society. The most unique thing about our civilization is its willingness to risk dystopia in order to reach for utopia. The prospect of dystopian disaster ought not to cause us to abandon the aspiration for a better world, a new world, one that surmounts all of the ignorance and petty violence of traditional cultures going back throughout history. On the face of it, traditional cultures seem to be more open to what our civilization deems paranormal phenomena. However, their acceptance of these phenomena is in a completely different form than that which it would take with the spectral revolution. It is a superstitious, pre-scientific relationship to these abilities, whereas what we would have on the other side of technological science is something quite different and more empowering. The mechanistic character of modern science is in part a response to the social conditions of the late medieval period and early Renaissance, when witches, sorcerers, and alchemists were being burned at the stake by inquisitors to the delight of fanatical mobs. After the burning of Giordano Bruno and other such intrepid inquirers into nature, early modern scientists and officials of the Church reached a tacit truce that would confine matters of the soul to the domain of faith. Scientists, in the wake of Descartes, agreed to focus on things that could be comprehended in terms of mathematical equations and that had a mathematical regularity to them. This not only afforded them easily repeatable results, it also allowed them to avoid being burned at the stake. By breaking this truce, we are potentially opening the door to something like witch burnings. At that point, total social collapse on the scale of a planet-wide Salem witch panic will be inevitable, unless we forge a society wherein no one would think to misuse ESP and PK to harm their fellow citizens by committing avaricious or vengeful crimes. Such crimes would be untraceable by normal law enforcement procedures and impossible to prosecute retroactively by means of the established procedures of our impartial justice system. The only thing to do is to ensure that these transgressions never take place to begin with. Since in the realm of psychic ability, which functions mostly unconsciously, to intend something may be to make it happen, there is no solution other than to make sure that such spectral crimes are unthinkable to whoever remains in society. Evolution is an exclusionary process that selects against the majority of a population group who fail to exhibit a mutation that adapts them to environmental stresses. The selection for a mutation is, as a general rule, a selection for deviation from the norm, and the evolution of a few who become the progenitors of a new species at the expense of the many. This selection will take place on the basis of who is capable of embodying the archetype of Prometheus, and thus of constructively taking conscious control over the spectral force of technoscientific development in the maelstrom of the event horizon of the technological singularity. Prometheus is the first freedom fighter. The archetype of Prometheus tacitly reflects a recognition that freedom is the most fundamental fact in the cosmos. The cosmos is inconceivable without consciousness, which presupposes intentionality. Some degree of free will, however conditioned, is a prerequisite of anyone being personally accountable for meaningful actions. A cosmos in which our creative acts do not add anything that was not predetermined and that could not have been foreseen or anticipated, even by the providence of a deity, is a world that is not worth living in. Prometheus is, of course, also the deity who most fully epitomizes foresight. His very name means to think ahead, and when Zeus chains him to a rock in the Caucasus, the eagle pecking out his liver is a symbolic expression of Zeus seeking to devour and appropriate the superior power of precognition, projection, and anticipation that is characteristic of Prometheus. However, the purpose of this definitively Promethean power is to expand our scope of free will and self-determination, not to constrain it with a sense of inexorable fate. Foreseeing possible futures, whether by the intuitive means of precognitive clairvoyance or through rational projective analysis, or a balance of both, actually affords us the opportunity to become the masters of our own destiny. Various factors do condition thought, constrain the will, and limit the imagination, but the capacity to exercise individual freedom at some level, despite these factors, is a sine qua non of any meaningful conception of existence. Only a discontinuous and somewhat internally dissonant cosmic structure, which always preserves a degree of chaos, allows for this kind of creative individuality. Understanding such a structure precludes and is mutually exclusive of a putatively scientific commitment to mechanistic reductionism, religious faith in an omniscient and omnipotent God, and the belief that there should or ever can be an end to violent struggle and strife. Any entity falsely claiming omniscience and omnipotence so as to demoralize people by subjecting them to the illusion of the futility of resistance is simply Zeus by another name. Prometheus redefines the preconceived limits of the possible, making the putatively impossible possible by means of technological science. The Prometheist has the strength to grasp the burdensome fact that the truth is what works. Knowledge is not the mirroring of an objective reality by a subjective cognition that only needs to be rendered more perceptive and precise, like a mirror that requires polishing. Knowledge is radically pragmatic because technology is ontologically prior to science, which is inseparable from the technology that makes theoretical research possible and renders knowledge discoverable. Rather than distinguishing science from technology and misconstruing technology as applied science, we should always conceive of them as the unified phenomenon of technoscience, wherein theoria is inconceivable apart from praxis. Scientific knowledge is the white light of molten metal in the forge of industrious innovation. Science ought not to be confined within any particular paradigm, which also constrains technological innovation. Instead, various paradigms, and the theories that they make possible, ought to be seen as different scientific models that each offer us the potential to craft certain types of technological tools for handling things better, and ultimately for expanding the horizon of our achievable aims. After the spectral revolution, multiple and mutually inconsistent paradigms can be exploited simultaneously for the sake of their power to foster discovery and act as a framework for invention. As the deity whose mind races ahead to survey the most distant horizons of possible futures, Prometheus also offers us inspiration as a sacred fountainhead of creativity. The inspirational power of beauty is an expression of the evolutionary force. A seduction to surmounting perceived limitations is what ought to resonate within oneself in the face of the harmonic proportionality or dynamic tension of an aesthetic work, whether in literature, painting, architecture, music, or performance art. Aesthetic experience should be an encounter with an expression of ascendant life, not for the sake of inspiring an awe that suffocates and dwarfs the soul, but with a view to kindling personal genius. Inspiration always involves a feedback loop with possible futures, so that the creativity it affords us can generate forms and architectonics that are never merely a repetition of the past. This also means that, however archaic certain elements of an aesthetic work may be, an orientation towards the future is necessary for it to be rightly deemed beautiful, rather than awfully monstrous in its titanic brutality. Evolutionary openness and an overcoming of alienation without the loss of individuality is characteristic of Prometheist aesthetics. Prometheus rebels against his fellow Titans on behalf of the Olympians, and then rebels against these gods who prove equally tyrannical for the sake of man. Resistance to any authority that is perceived to be arbitrary and illegitimate is integral to the Prometheist ethos. Governments are legitimate power structures only insofar as they serve to secure creative, industrious, and exploratory enterprises. The only justification for sovereign power, namely the force of law over the lives of citizens in any state, is to secure the liberty of those individuals to pursue their projects. A Prometheist government would unchain all productive economic forces while protecting the creative and industrious individual, who ought to be superhumanly empowered thereby, from an instrumental dehumanization and existential degradation. It is not the business of government to legislate morality or propagandize about the meaning of life. The liberty of individuals is limited with justification only when that constraint serves the purpose of ultimately securing the same individual's freedom from collective coercion and freedom for the personal pursuit of meaning, purpose, wonder, and creative power. The constitutional order of any regime should reflect this conception of justice in the sense of the justification of state power that is deemed to be legitimate. Every other political order or disorder ought to be considered a type of tyranny to be resisted, or an anarchy that invites tyranny to fill the vacuum of chaos with rigid order. The willingness of Prometheus as a loving father to sacrifice himself as a martyr for the sake of emancipating his children makes him the most ethical of all deities. While this tragic martyrdom is certainly a symbol of salvific forbearance, that it is suffered and endured as a punishment for offering us technoscientific empowerment and unleashing our artistic creativity should also be read as a recognition of the fact that cultivating ethos, personally and socially, is about the pursuit of excellence. This means that the Prometheist will have no tolerance for the putatively moral outrage that calls for so-called social justice by valorizing disability and resentfully desecrating and destroying everything that memorializes the achievement of those who excelled in various endeavors. It also means that any morality that demands adherence to a code of conduct that is arbitrarily imposed, as in a religious revelation, or affirmed merely on the basis of ossified customs and in the name of ancestral authority, is fundamentally unethical. Individuation is indispensable to being an authentic and conscientious person who can contribute to fostering an ethical society, which in turn provides children with an environment that encourages them to excel. An ethos, a character or moral fiber geared toward the progressive enhancement of capacities for creative expression, does depend, to some extent, on embracing a mythos. Personal meaning cannot be forged by fiat from out of a cultural historical vacuum. Individuals need to draw from the mythic structures of living traditions and the archetypes that sustain these structures on the level of the collective unconscious. But ethical conduct always involves a situational adaptation and appropriation of this heritage, not a subservience to it that is tantamount to a tyranny of the past over present and future generations. Our traditional heritages ought to inspire us in a daimonic fashion rather than subject us to demonic possession. With a view to these psychological and sociological considerations, the mythos of Prometheus is the most progressive archetypal basis for an ethical society on the other side of the spectral revolution. Prometheus is the ultimate revolutionary specter, the specter of the evolutionary revolution. In other words, the spectral revolution.